Wheeler, and I'm here with my co-host Anthony Marquetta. Anthony, how are you doing today?
Eh,
Eh. So
been worse, been better.
this is the closest he's ever had to a bad day in his life. I
Oh,
want you guys all to know this, comprehend it, because he's had a good day all day, and now
I've
he's
never had a bad day. I mean, I never
never.
will.
It's true. So today we are discussing fairy tales. Uh, they're fairly interesting. Um, just in general, as a sort of a view into the culture of the times and the people that it's pulled out of, but also just in its difference from myth, right? Nobody looks at the Greek myths and or the Norse sagas or the Hindu Bodhisattva's or whatever it's called, and goes, "Yeah, that's a fairy tale," except to insult it. There's a solid difference, partially because these things are explicitly about gods and are often set the myths. I mean, are often set in like before times, before writing or during the age of heroes or whatever. But also it's separated out from the common lives of the people at this time. Like there may have been, there's Aesop's fables, of course, um, but and they involve the Greek gods, and some of the newer fables involve, like Jesus or Peter or Paul or something like that, going around doing good deeds. But nobody really, you know, they sort of fall into the fable category. Even though you could say, well, it's a short story with a moral lesson. It's not the same as a fairy tale or a myth. In fairy tales, you have these often unfortunate characters, often saved either by their own wit or by providence, dealing with monstrous forces beyond their ken, that only if they're clever enough or blessed enough can they overcome them. There's almost a martial spirit to them in ways different from the heroic actions of the myth or the cunning, clever, or providential actions or of the fables. um, it's often separated from a moral lesson. The moral lesson in Jack the Giant Slayer is kind of just be brave. But in the fables thing, it's sour grapes. Does that make sense, Anthony?
Yes, it does.
Good, good. And that's all I'm going to say for the rest of the episode. Take it away, Anthony.
Oh, I wasn't prepared. No, I'm kidding. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. No, no. There's a lot more to it, and I'd be happy to talk about it in detail, because it is fascinating. It is, how do I want to put it, an image into the minds of those who lived in those times. What did they fear? Well, if you read a lot of the fairy tales, it's very clear that everyone feared famine. Famine is all over the place at all times. Um, One of my favorite fairy tales is the girl with the silver hands. Who, even though she's the daughter of a miller, they're poor. They're starving. They need money. How is this when you're a miller, which literally prints money in the form of flour? Things like that.
yeah. Any discussion of fairy tales is going to require a read of probably the greatest essay in the history of the genre. There's once again much discussion going on whether fantasy and science fiction even should be differentiated as genres or if it's just pointless gatekeeping. Um, this happens every so often in our circles. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Autism.
it
What?
is. I don't find the conversation particularly interesting. My take is if viewers are still going to
Hmm.
look on Amazon for I want fantasy or I want science fiction, then it stands to reason that they should still be written and called that. And it's really that simple.
Yep.
Um, Now, the idea that the modern genre is being limited is something, but Tolkien wrote his famous work on fairy stories. Now, as many people will point out, when you actually read The Lord of the Rings, it's very different than what you're expecting. It's sort of like, people have said this before, Stagecoach by John Ford, right? Came out in what, the 1930s? I'm gonna double
Sure.
check this. Stagecoach Ford. Yep, 1939. There you go. So, Stagecoach came out in 1939. A group of travelers driving on a stagecoach through Apache territory. All right, that's fine. Well, what people now, if you want to think of like what is the Western that defines Westerns, not the best Western, but when you think of Westerns and what a Western is, this is what you think of. Probably quite a lot of people would say Stagecoach. It seems like it comes very early and all of that. There is only one problem with this. Stagecoach was created and written as a subversion of Westerns, which were already at that time and incredibly popular and incredibly like well-worn genre. One of the first hit movies, like big star vehicles, was Gary Cooper in The Virginian, which was like from the 1920s. So already Westerns were established enough that by 1939, the tropes were embedded in the public consciousness well enough that you could subvert them and people would know what you were doing at the time. Of course, what happened is that Stagecoach itself became so famous and so well known that people thought of Westerns as movies like Stagecoach, when that's actually not what they were like at all. At least not up until that point. Lord of the Rings, and this is important to the fairy tale discussion, I promise. Lord of the Rings was a lot like that. What people didn't realize, I don't think that Tolkien was intentionally making a subversion of the fantasy. I don't think that was really in his head at all. I don't think that he ever intended it to be subversive. In fact, he intended it to be, as we like to call it, superversive. And I think that was, even though he wouldn't have used that phrase, I think that was a very explicit intention with The Lord of the Rings. With that said, if you actually read and pay attention to what is going on in The Lord of the Rings, what you realize is that what you have is actually a subversion of like what we tend to think of as the quote unquote traditional fantasy. It's like you have this fellowship of people who's going on a quest, except it's not a quest to get something. It's not even a quest to defeat someone. It's a quest to destroy something. And the person who is leading the quest isn't the long-lost king who is retaking his throne to take back his throne, but it's like the equivalent of landed gentry, right? Basically like a relatively well-to-do Englishman, right, is just given a job to be like, hey, by the way, you should try that. You should figure this one out. In fact, a lot of the people in the fellowship end up being a part of this sort of like landed gentry class. The lowest class member of the fellowship, remember, is Sam, by far. In fact, I think he's the only like working class member of the fellowship. Everybody else is royalty to some degree or other. And yes, this includes Merry and Pippin, who are in what would probably be considered the royal line of the Shire and Buckland.
Actually, yeah,
they're in the noble class.
They're scions of the two major houses, quote unquote.
Yes.
Of the Hobbits.
Frodo himself, the Bagginses, are very well respected. He is the heir of Bilbo, who was extremely rich and comes from two also very rich houses. So even though Frodo is not royalty, he's something of like landed gentry. So you have like this subversion where the two of the weakest characters in the story end up being the ones who actually need to fulfill the quest. And the quest is not to defeat the villain, nor is the quest being undertaken by the traditional hero character, but the quest is to destroy something. And in destroying this thing, it's not like a morally neutral act either. It's not like, or even a morally, like a straightforwardly positive act. Destroying the ring is going to weaken the power of the elves, who are portrayed in the Lord of the Rings itself, granted not in the extended material, but in the Lord of the Rings itself, as a straightforward force for good in the world. Like, everybody loves the elves, everybody admires the elves, right? And they're going to be gone if this ring is destroyed. Like, they're going to be driven away. The men are going to take over. And they decide to do it anyway. The elves decide to make the sacrifice. Legolas is an elf, and he is the least important, despite being probably the most physically capable of the Fellowship, although you could also argue Gimli. Believe it or not, once again, this is one of those other things that people assume isn't the case. It's like, oh, Legolas is, he's like a magic elf person, so clearly he's the strongest, right? But if you actually read the text, Gimli is literally having the slaughter competition with Legolas, and I think he even wins. So Gimli might actually be the strongest fighter in the Fellowship. Anyway, like, Legolas, one of the strongest fighters of the Fellowship, part of the royal line of the Wood Elves, immortal, magical powers, is easily the least important member. You could basically cut Legolas out of the story, and the major events of the story would barely change. So
Doesn't he like just not talk to Frodo and the other hobbits except, to say, "And you have my bow"?
Oh yeah, he doesn't talk to them. It's real. He doesn't talk to Frodo. It's real. There's a really great meme of this at the end when like Frodo's meeting everybody at the end. Like he's in the hospital or in his sick room, and they're all coming to meet him while he's in bed. And he goes, and then he just says ... and then Legolas goes, Legolas, you're alive.
Is that in there?
No, it's not actually in the book, obviously. That would have been too silly, but it's a pretty good meme.
You had me going.
No, it's a pretty good meme though. It's just like, and ... Legolas. But yeah, the point being that the Lord of the Rings is itself in many ways an anti-fantasy. I would even argue like Robert E. Howard was writing at around roughly the same time as Conan. In many ways, the Lord of the Rings is like the anti-Conan the Barbarian. I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of the pulp rev guys look at Lord of the Rings with suspicion. It's why Jeffro has even talked about it as like Lord of the Rings is actually hyper-modernist. And in some ways, he's very, very wrong. And in other ways, he is 100% and exactly correct, right? What Tolkien is doing is beating modernists at their own game, right? Like modernists are into like very realistic, very grounded fiction. And when you actually look into the logistics of everything that happens in The Lord of the Rings, with the exception of stuff that was added in The Hobbit and that Tolkien wasn't thinking very hard about because it was a children's book, namely like, the Hobbits apparently have the industry to create things like pocket watches, which is actually like a massive inconsistency in the world of The Lord of the Rings. But this was clearly like invented by, this was written into The Hobbit before he had this idea of expanding The Hobbit into his full legendarium. So you could kind of forgive it. Anyway, with the exception of stuff like that, people have done like analyses of, like say the military campaigns in The Lord of the Rings, and they are like unbelievably accurate. Like how, like there's a great, I'll have to link it to you, Ben. There's like a fantastic series of blog posts that analyzes the military campaigns in The Lord of the Rings and how realistic they are, and compares them, by the way, to the Lord of the Rings films. Obviously, the films are much less accurate, and it's not entirely their fault because it involves an attention to detail that wouldn't really be fair in films, although some of it isn't excusable. But yeah, the attention to detail that Tolkien puts into the story is crazy. Things like dates and times, the logistics of movements of armies and people, and the makeup of the world and things like that are all unbelievably accurate. That was something that fantasy never really cared that much about until Tolkien. And then it became like the thing in fantasy. You wanted really, really strong world building. You could even argue, I would argue that Faramir in some ways is like the anti-Conan the Barbarian. That's where you get Faramir's amazing line, you know, I love not the sword for its sharpness nor the arrow for its swiftness. I love only that which they defend. That is the precise, like, you honestly could not contrast with Conan the Barbarian more perfectly than that, right? Conan loves the sword for its sharpness, and he loves the arrow for its swiftness, and he loves the fight for the rush that it gives him, and he loves the thrill of life. And Faramir is saying that he would give it all up. So yeah, they're precisely opposite each other.
There's a different spirit, you know, to something like, you know, Conan the Barbarian, you know, which is set in this Hyperborean, you know, past of man, and Tolkien's own Legendarium, which is, as you must remember, dear audience, also set in the past of this world. So it's how do I want to put it? Like there's different mindsets to it. You know, Conan the Barbarian might have said, "Oh, these are, you know, mercenaries from Underland, swarthy and cruel," you know, and there's a definite world that you can create out of the world building, but he never actually bothers with logistics in the way that you know Tolkien does. You know, they have to worry in Tolkien. They worry about the bread they're going to eat, or the, you know, path, you know, during winter through the mountains and so on. You know, and it gives it a very realistic feel that is, shall we say, imitated by lesser writers. Notably, part of the reason people freaked out about the shit show of the last season of Game of Thrones is because George R. R. Martin actually cared about timing and stuff like that, and would give even though I wouldn't say that it would be accurate, it gave a realistic look to how long it takes to travel from A to B. You know, it acted like it knew what it was doing. But if you look at things like the show, all of a sudden the dragons are flying everywhere. You know, people are moving too fast. You know, even if they double marched, blah blah blah. You know, so it violated something the readers were looking for. The watchers rather were looking for and praised it for. You know, it broke one of the rules of the show, so to speak, and ruined the verisimilitude. So it's like I view Tolkien in a slightly different light. I view it as like the culmination of things like, you know, fairy tales and ancient histories, you know, that Hyperborean ideas and other things like that, sort of coming into one pinnacle. You know, like you can't, you know, imitate Tolkien. Tolkien's just too
Yeah,
good.
I would almost
Uh,
argue that what Tolkien was doing was not. Tolkien wasn't like, this is the problem with talking about Tolkien as fantasy. You have to talk about Tolkien as fantasy in the modern day, right? But I don't think that
mm-hmm.
Tolkien was working in the fantasy tradition basically at all, right? Like, I
Right.
actually don't think that Tolkien really cared about what other fantasy books were doing at the time, right? Like, I don't think that it mattered to him because he wasn't
Yep.
writing a fantasy. Like, what were the fantasies the pre-Tolkien fantasies? You had Dunsany. He was like the original Lord of Fantasy. What, Abraham Merritt, right? Like, he had a bunch of
Yeah.
stuff. Conan the Barbarian. You had the sword and sorcery. You know, I'm not an expert in the pulp era. If you had someone here, I'm sure they would be yelling at me right now about like, how dare you miss these authors, and I'm sure they're correct. But that's my point, right? Like, all of these, they're absolutely, that's the thing that people are wrong about. There was a strong fantasy tradition pre-Tolkien. That's entirely my point, right?
Yes.
And Tolkien was writing divorced from it. This is not to say that he was writing intentionally contra or subversive of it. I don't think he was. He simply wasn't concerned with it. Like you go, oh, Tolkien's elves are different. Indeed, they are. They are different. But here is the difference. And this is a very crucial, very critical, very important difference. Tolkien was not writing his elves to be different from previous versions of elves. He was not going, how did other people do elves? Let me write my elves differently than them. I don't think he would, if his elves were the same as every other elf, but it fit his story, I don't think that Tolkien would have cared. The reason that Tolkien's elves were quote unquote different, because believe it or not, Tolkien's elves were the different ones, right? Is that was the story he was writing. He was writing in a he was trying to create a national mythology for England. He claimed England had no national mythology. And yes, by the way, that does mean that he denied that King Arthur was a part of England's national mythology. He thought it was too French. He's also not entirely wrong. He's not completely wrong. I'm just saying. Also, like, I mean, I guess it's British, but like the origins of the Arthur story come from Wales, like not England per se. It's weird.
Well, but it's like, to me, it's like, yeah, sure, but like England, while the English are a definite people, it's like there's almost no Britons, pure-blooded. Like there are some pure-blooded Britons left, like in Cornwall and stuff like that. But it's like like the dominant culture changed every 500 years, 300 years, from Anglo-Saxon to Dane to Norman, and then it kind of stayed Norman, but it kind of forged into its own thing, mixed with French courtly manners, and mythology. Like but it's not like I don't know. To me, King Arthur is the founding myth of Britain, and I will not abide any other opinion about it.
Yeah, Tolkien was a bit of a curmudgeon.
In other words,
he was like, no, too much French.
You're the greatest author of our time. There's nobody better educated than you, but you're wrong.
So this is all to say that Tolkien knew about the fantasy tradition, but like the Lord of the Rings wasn't written in the fantasy tradition. What he was doing with the Lord of the Rings was something different. He was hearkening back to, like, when you go, you have to go back. Tolkien was going all the way back. He was going back to, his inspiration was the Norse sagas. His inspiration
you have to go back to the panspermian vat of ooze that your amoeboid ancestors came from. You're going back to the panspermia comet.
He was going back to, like, actually though, the Norse sagas are a big inspiration for Lord of the Rings. Beowulf, of course, Tolkien has his famous translation of Beowulf that is considered by many people to be, even to this day, one of the best translations of Beowulf. It's funny because unlike Lewis, Tolkien only really wrote two particularly notable nonfiction essays. It's just really funny that those two nonfiction essays he wrote are considered two of the great nonfiction essays in each of their respective genres. Beowulf, the Monster and the Critics, and On Fairy Stories, which is why I'm talking about Tolkien so much. We will get there. So Beowulf, the Monster and the Critics was literally Tolkien saying all the critics. Every now and then you get people like this. Like I mentioned this when we had on Dale Alquist, the Chesterton scholar. I mentioned the reason that we read Dickens in school is because of G.K. Chesterton, right? He kind of salvage Dickens' reputation from being just like, a populist author enjoyed by the people to someone who actually was worthy of critical attention, right? And Alquist confirmed this.
Right.
Believe it or not, Tolkien did the same thing to Beowulf. Beowulf was looked at as something like a historical curiosity more than anything else, but it wasn't really respected as a poem. And Tolkien said, no, actually, Beowulf is masterfully written. That's why, and the critics are wrong, hence the Monster and the Critics. A lot of the point was that people were like, oh, the monsters are just, like there because he wanted a bunch of action. And Tolkien's going like, no, actually, the monsters in Beowulf are critical to the story. You need them, right?
Yep.
which, for the record, is precisely right.
Like what kind of story did they expect there to be if the monsters didn't exist? It's like it's how do I want to put it? Like the critics of that time were hoity-toity. They were highfalutin and other such Americanisms. Um, they look down on things like bloodshed and masculine virtue and stuff like that, even though they'd never say it. But it was like if you want to think about it, there were a lot of movements, political or otherwise, during the 1900s to 1945 that were essentially like you'd have like man clubs, and not like gay man clubs, though I'm sure some were, uh, or like in the sense of like what a grifter would call his alpha camp. But no, they'd be like dueling societies, aristocratic manor bun kind of things. Even though Evelo was kind of like a weirdo, he talked about a lot of this stuff, quite consistently, and he's just the guy that we've sort of latched on to. A set like a lot of the officer corps of every side of World War One and Two were in these societies, these masculine societies, like the Hitler Youth and stuff like that. Boy Scouts of America didn't come. Yeah, and I just equated the two. Didn't come from ex nihilo, right? There's an idea that sort of pervades even unto now that the monsters aren't really monsters. And of course, Tolkien, in his wisdom, because I now agree with his idea, he can do no wrong. Sort of calls them out on it.
Yeah, and for the record, this essay was so influential that it basically is now just the standard in Beowulf scholarship. Like, just like with Chesterton, with Dickens, the reason that Beowulf is treated as an academically respectable work, worthy of study, is Tolkien. Tolkien did this. So you have all of this, and then he writes this essay on fairy stories. And on fairy stories, I've seen people like, Kursova used to have this opinion, and then I remember like he read it, and then he goes, okay, actually, now that I've read it, it's actually like better than I was expecting. That Tolkien's just kind of being a scold in the essay. He's just defining things, and talking animal stories aren't fairy stories. These are real fairy stories, and if you get it wrong, you're wrong, Like,
it's because they're fables.
Yes.
Fables.
But that's not really that's not quite fair, right? On Fairy Stories is an incredibly influential essay. It's also an incredibly good essay. It's a must read if you've written anything in fantasy before. And if you want to write some sort of fantastic fiction, then On Fairy Stories is a very it is a seminal work, right? Once again, it's one of the two essays, basically, the two nonfiction things that anybody knows, at least, besides his letters, that Tolkien got published. And both of them happen to be like genre defining. So On Fairy Stories is really about like what makes something a proper fairy story. What is the world? What is a fairy story? What do you call? How do you make something a fairy story? And yes, he would consider talking animal stories fables. Tolkien really didn't like. Infamously, Tolkien never really liked Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. I will grant here that I think that that's always been somewhat exaggerated. Like, if you actually read what Tolkien said about it, it's always just like, I don't know, he includes some stuff I wouldn't have included. And everybody turns it into, it drove Tolkien nuts and he hated it. And it's like, that's not really what he said. It was more like he said, man, this world building isn't the sort of thing I would have done. I don't know if I like it. And then everybody turns it into like, Tolkien hated Narnia. But famously, he never really was a fan of the world building of Narnia. I'm pretty sure that Father Christmas being in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe famously drove him nuts. He was just like, but how? It doesn't, Jack. It makes no sense, Jack. How is there Father Christmas? How is there Christmas, Jack? Please.
You got a problem with Christmas, Catholic? You got a problem? Huh? You got a problem with a little Christmas cheer in the lands of Narnia? Giving out swords to kids?
Jack, please. Jesus is a lion. How is there Christmas?
Well,
what are they celebrating, Jack?
The birth of the Jesus allegory lion.
It's just Aslan's birthday. And then they go, oh, so that's, and goes, wait, Father Christmas is here? So, like, are you celebrating the incarnation? And they go, incarnation? What are you talking about? What? Why is Santa here? And they go, Santa?
Santa?
Yeah, by the way, I used to really like the original Chronicles of Narnia, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie, the Walden Media one, until I had a conversation with Jaji about it. And then she said, oh no, I hate that movie. I'm like, really? Why? And she goes, well, they ruined Peter. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, because, well, read the original book. Peter's brave. He jumps into battle. He's scared, but he does it. And Lewis even has a line where it's like, Peter didn't want to do it, but that didn't matter, because he had to. And then in this one, it's like he's doubtful and he hesitates and then it was like a magic eye, one of those magic eye things. Like my eyes slid into focus and now I can't watch the movie anymore. She ruined the movie for me. Now I'm like, no, this movie's trash. I was wrong. It's terrible. But anyway, yeah, and so when Tolkien writes on fairy stories, it needs to be taken seriously. I'm going to look it up to get a very accurate idea of exactly what he was saying in it. Yeah, on fairy stories, need to have. He was saying that they need 4 qualities in them, and I'm getting this off. I've read the essay multiple times, but I want a summary in front of me, so I'm just looking it up quick on Wikipedia. Sue me. Should I say Infogalactic? I mean Infogalactic. Obviously, I would never use Wikipedia, but anyway. So, point is, on fairy stories is he claims that fairy stories need to contain 4 qualities: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And he says that the secondary world needs to have a structure with coherently related parts, but that works by its effect on the reader. Humans are inside of the structure, so we can't analyze it objectively. So what does he mean by this? Like, what exactly is Tolkien trying to say when he says this? I think, number one, the more interesting part of it is the structure of the fairy story. Fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation. If you think of a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales and things like that, they actually do often have those parts, right? Think of Cinderella, right? Now, Cinderella, people will try and claim that, Cinderella originally came from the Far East or whatever. This is wrong. The absolute earliest version of Cinderella that we have is from ancient Greece. So Cinderella is a firmly Western fairy tale. Chinese can suck it.
I firmly believe that they, through cultural
they got it from us. Their version came after ours.
Right.
The earliest version of Cinderella comes from ancient Greece. I
believe that for
absolutely
Aladdin
Western.
Too.
Well, Aladdin's Persian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Persian,
Arabian.
it's China. Yeah, they claim he's from China, but they clearly didn't know anything about China, so it's functionally Persian.
Yeah, but it's also like, what I mean is that China has a very, very long history of taking other people's things and then claiming they invented it, and they do not break kayfabe. So it's like
Yeah.
you just have to say no, you're wrong. And even if they might be right in the case of Aladdin, quite frankly, all the stuff I've ever found until some obscure Chinese researcher found a story that doesn't gel with the Chinese hive mind at all. Uh, like the idea that they would write about a thief in China and not have him have severe like it doesn't make sense. And I don't. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Um, no, this is like it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine because Cinderella, I will admit, is one of those stories where there are many, many, many different versions of it all around the world. It's spread everywhere, at least on like the continent. You know, into Africa, into Europe, into Asia. There are versions of Cinderella, and people go, "Oh, well, the Grimm's version isn't the earliest," which is true. Right. That factually, that is correct. Grimm's version of Cinderella is not the earliest. However, the earliest is Western. It's from ancient Greece. It's a short version of Cinderella, but it's clearly Cinderella. It's like she loses her shoe and the guy finds it and then finds the person the shoe belonged to and they get married. Like that's clearly the proto Cinderella. So anyway, if you think about it, let's look at that structure that Tolkien was saying again: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Cinderella contains all of this, right? You have the fantasy, you have the fairy godmother, you have the escape, literally the clock striking midnight. Or like the recovery that she's found, the consolation, the marriage, all of these things. Lord of the Rings, by this structure, is absolutely a fairy story. By the way, people will try really, really, really hard to fit Lord of the Rings into the hero's journey structure, and they are absolutely wrong to do so. Tolkien was explicitly not writing a hero's journey story. It's not the hero's journey. Frodo famously fails at the end of the story.
Yeah. He was completely aware of the hero's journey. He just didn't do it.
Yeah, he was aware of the hero's journey. I don't know what his opinion of it. I'm sure he was aware of it just because he's aware of all of these things. He was a scholar of this field, But I don't know what his opinion of was it. I have a low opinion of Campbell's hero's journey. I'm with John C. Wright on this. I think that it's mostly flim-flam. That he was trying to claim that there's some sort of recurring structure, but in order to do so, he needs to force too many different things to fit that don't really fit, and then it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, it's like there's things that if you squint at it, yeah, okay, this has this has that, but like it's never okay. So it's like you ever do something on reflex and it works out, but then you do it on purpose and everyone laughs at you because you failed.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that. Like you will take parts of the hero journey, like with our own Pinkerton's ghosts. All of our characters have descended into hell. They have come out, but in reality, they didn't get anything out of it. But if you squinted, in fact, they lost quite a bit. But if you squinted at it and you said, well, Jack Morrow going after his mother is like this part, and then he comes out and, he seems to be able to kill better. But in reality, I make it very clear it's a kind of battle madness. He's gone berserk, and that's part of the parallel arcs that we planned for Jack and Sean to work together,
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it looks like that, right? But in reality, we're not even considering the hero's journey. It just happens to be parallel to it. And because it's culturally relevant, we can talk about it and say this, what we're saying now. Right? Like it's because we are now meta aware that we can discuss the meta. However, it doesn't have any particular meaning on the active writing event.
Right. The other problem with it is that hero's journey is often used to mean like whatever you wanted to mean in the moment. Like, oh, X story follows the hero's journey. Meanwhile, if you actually read Campbell's hero's journey, it's incredibly long and incredibly specific and has many different parts that most people don't include, like, and don't even try to include. When someone says, "Oh, this is the hero's journey," they might even say they're relating it to Campbell incorrectly. But like, actually, I'll give a really good example of this because Lucas loved to claim this. Lucas was lying. Because Lucas lied about everything when it came to the origin of Star Wars. Star Wars, right? The original Star Wars, what's now called New Hope. Lucas claimed he was following Campbell's hero's journey, but if you actually read Campbell's hero's journey and then you actually watch Lucas's movie, this is complete nonsense. It's clearly not following Campbell's hero's journey because Campbell's hero's journey is way more complicated than what we see in Star Wars. In reality, like that sort of storyline of, a simple farm boy whose parents are killed and then he gets a mentor who then helps him to defeat the evil empire is just like a basic story structure. It's not the hero's journey. It's something closer to like the save the cat structure, right? The other thing is that people tend to think of there as like, oh, this is how plots work. And they think of like Freytag's 5-part structure, Aristotle's 3-act structure, which, by the way, is the best because it is the only one I've ever seen that every single story has it, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Aristotle wins again. Anyway, you get like the Freytag 5-act structure. Except, there's a big problem with the Freytag 5-act structure, which is that it was actually written for dramatic tragedies in play form. That was the purpose of Freytag's 5-part structure. It is taught in schools to this day. Like, I've seen it done. Like, people will go, oh, these are the 5 parts. You need climax, rising action, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. They get this from Freytag's 5-part structure. This is total nonsense. The 5-act structure was specifically intended for how to write a good tragedy in a stage play. It wasn't meant for every story to fit into that structure. This idea that there is one structure that's going to work and this is how a story needs to work is absolutely wrong and always has been.
It's designed to like sell books is what it is.
It is. Like, Save the Cat is the big one. And people have written, like, Kill the Cat and whatever. And Save the Cat is good. Like, if you want to know how to do a basic trial, all of these plot structures, really, they can work for specific things. I'm not saying that you can't use them. I'm saying you need to get rid of the idea that if your story doesn't follow these things, you're missing something. You're not. Like, that's not how it works.
Yep.
Miyazaki has it too. People will often say this and they were always wrong. Like Roger Ebert, who is a huge Miyazaki fan, even fans who don't know what he's doing will go, oh, Miyazaki has plotless movies. This is entirely incorrect. He never has plotless movies. He's using a type of plot structure that's very common in Japan. Miyazaki's a huge fan of it. Once you know it, you can't unsee it because it's in most of Miyazaki's films. Obviously, I'm talking about the Kishouden Ketsu, right? By the way, it actually unlocks a lot of anime. Like, people will go, oh, why is this story moving so slowly? Like, why is it structured in this way? And 9 times out of 10, it's because the story is a Kishouden Ketsu. Like, Your Name, for example, is a Kishouden Ketsu. If you actually, like, sit down, people... It's weird because it doesn't fit what people normally think of. If you know it, they go like, oh, those are like the small slice of life things like Totoro. Like, no, it's a much broader structure than that. Once you understand what it is, you'll see it everywhere. Your Name has it. Spirited Away is a Kishouden Ketsu. Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, The Wind Rises. I don't know about How Do You Live. I would need to sit and go through it again. I probably need to watch it one more time too. In fact, maybe I will. But like, I wouldn't be surprised if How Do You Live was a Kishouden Ketsu. Like, this idea that you need to follow. This is why I like to say that Miyazaki's...
Could you explain what a Kishouden Ketsu is?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. A Kishouten Ketsu is a 4-act structure, and it gets some fame as saying it's like a structure that doesn't need, it's a plot structure, it doesn't need conflict. In Western media, you will often be told that a plot needs conflict in order for it to work. This isn't strictly true. You would, not entirely anyway. Granted that in most cases you do, and for most types of stories you're going to tell, you need a conflict. However, strictly speaking, you do not. The Kishouten Ketsu doesn't require a conflict. It's a 4-act structure, and it goes something like this. You have introduction, expansion, what I would call the twist, or the surprise maybe, and then the resolution. And the resolution connects the twist to the other 2 parts, right? So My Neighbor Totoro is an absolutely perfect example of a Kishouten Ketsu. Introduction, you meet the characters. They're moving to a new house. Their mom is in the hospital, right? Expansion, you are introduced to the world. You meet Totoro. They go to school. You learn more about their relationship and what's going on with their mom. The twist, something that seemingly random happens. May goes missing, right? They learn that their mom's not coming home when they think she will, and May goes to find her, and she goes missing. Resolution, Totoro comes back and helps them find May and brings them to their mom, who they learn is actually okay, right? It connects the first 2 parts to the twist. So everything that was established in the introduction and the expansion is brought into the twist so that everything works. Your Name, also a Kishouten Ketsu. Introduction, you meet the characters. They're doing this thing, right? Like where they're switching bodies. Expansion, you learn more about their lives and how they're dealing with it. The twist, suddenly it stops happening, and then you learn that that there's time travel and that the town was destroyed by a meteor or something. And the resolution, well, they managed to save the town by switching into each other's bodies one more time and like resolving things. You know, it's been a few years since I've seen Your Name, but point is, it's a Kishouten Ketsu, right? So when you talk about the different types of plot structures, to say that there's no structure to these movies, or that it's structured slowly, or that it's like a weird structure, is wrong. It's just using a different structure. And this idea that it's like, oh, you didn't include the meeting with a mentor in your book. You didn't include, like, you know, the goddess or whatever, because Joseph Campbell has like 20 or 30 different points in his hero's journey.
It's like how
wrong.
do you do that for Your Name? Does he meet some like old transsexual? I was a boy once, and then I turned myself into a woman.
You know what's funny is that he actually does meet somebody who did do, like, this scene that you're describing kind of does happen.
Oh.
If you remember, the grandmother, he meets the grandmother, and the grandmother's like, oh, you switched bodies with Mitsuha, didn't you? And he's like, yeah, I did that. So that actually does happen. It's kind of funny that you say that, and there is a scene that's very much like that in the movie. But yeah, it's really interesting. Like, Miyazaki loves Kishouten Ketsus. He uses them in probably most of his movies. I don't know if I would say all of them. I would really need to sit and like I don't know if Cagliostro is a Kishouten Ketsu. I don't know if Castle in the Sky is. These are like adventure films, but like The Wind Rises absolutely is. Spirited Away, absolutely a Kishouten Ketsu. Like, absolutely. You have the introduction to the spirit world, the expansion. She gets a job. She learns more. She has to help the One River spirit. The twist, Taku gets sick. Mm-hmm. Right? And then the resolution, where everything she's learned on her journey helps her solve the problem at the end. That's why people go like, oh, Spirited Away, it's such a weird, unstructured plot. It's not. It is. Somebody said this, like, the thing about Spirited Away is that it's like ordering number 20 on the Chinese takeout menu of fairy stories. It is such a standard fairy story that it literally uses the plot of another Studio Ghibli movie that was made earlier that year. That's The Cat Returns. They have the same basic plot. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they are the same movie. They're extremely different. They like if you were to watch The Cat Returns, it doesn't really tell you if whether you would or would not like Spirited Away. What I'm saying is that conceptually, Spirited Away is doing the same thing.
You know what's you know what? Cat Returns is more like a fairy tale than a lot of other uh
Oh, yeah.
like just you have the girl wandering into the magical world through how do I want to put it, like yeah, she chose to save the cat, but really she'd be a bad person to be able to save the cat and not save the cat, so we're ignoring that.
She does
uh
risk her life to save the cat, to be fair. There's a legitimate choice here. That's why she's rewarded for it, because like
Anthony, I've
she
seen
almost
enough
gets
isekais to know that she was
yeah.
never in any danger. She would have just woken up in Ultima Underworld or something like that. Perfectly fine,
No,
just roll forward.
in
Yeah.
all
No,
seriousness,
she
she would have
did.
woken up in the cat world,
Yes.
which
Uh,
could have been an interesting movie in its own right, but would have been a different movie.
oh no, your body's dead. So now you're a cat. I don't want to be
I
a
can
cat.
absolutely imagine that one cat who's like the advisor cat saying it to her exactly like that. It's like, can I go back? Oh no, you are very dead.
I love that advisor cat. I love all the cats, especially the king cat. Um, but what was I thinking? Oh yeah, so it's like there's also like with beyond just like this traditional Japanese four course structure, um, like a succulent fish meal of sushi and such. Uh, there is like Japanese ideas that come in quite strongly, like the parade of monsters and things like that, and mysterious locations where monsters are actually just kind of living and having commerce with each other. Like there's a like Monster Island, except like with the bathhouse, uh, as is seen quite often in Japanese stories, except it's just a bathhouse, and there's food vendor stalls and stuff like that. But also, if you eat this at the stalls, you get turned into a pig. So there's like it's still that mystical je ne sais pas, but also a very strong Japanese flavor that you just can't, neglect without losing the essence of the story itself. Similar to removing the European element out of fairy tales.
Yeah, I would agree with this. Yeah, and Bradford Walker says if we're going to keep getting isekai out of Japan, I want to see more fairy stories and less pink slime leftovers of Lester Del Rey's Mad Lib template. Fair. Yeah, so in Tolkien's on fairy stories, he does distinguish them from other genres. And by the way, this answers the question definitively. I'm sorry, Pulp Rev Bros, but J.R.R. Tolkien says science fiction is real. Therefore, you're wrong. However, he
You're
never
right.
does. He
It
never
is a
does say
fantasy.
that
Yes.
that fantasy exists. So, ironically, J.R.R. Tolkien never calls fantasy a genre, but he does call science fiction a genre.
I can't unpack it. It's
It's
all
pretty funny.
mysterious to me. It's all strange.
Yeah, he distinguishes it from what he calls traveler's tales, and he's referring to like literally Gulliver's Travels, right? And they said he also distinguishes it from science fiction. And he uses H.G. Wells' Time Machine and beast fables like The Tale of Peter Rabbit and dream stories like Alice in Wonderland. And Tolkien's point is that one of the differences with a fairy tale versus these other, or a fairy story versus these other types of stories, especially like the dream story or the beast fable, is that fairy tales need to be presented as true.
Yes.
And he says that means there cannot be anything in the mechanics of the fairy tale suggesting that the framework in which it occurs is a figment or an illusion. So, for example, he would have considered the original Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum to be a fairy tale. He would have considered the movie to be a dream story. He would not have considered it a fairy tale.
Right.
And I think that that is correct. Yeah, I've actually had this discussion before. It's interesting. I think I had it with John on his blog. I was trying to figure out, like, why does the Wizard of Oz movie work? Because it shouldn't, right? Like, and I think the answer is that there is change at the end of the film. It's not like the adventure meant nothing. It's just that the change was internal to the character.
Yes.
So, you know, it's not like it was all a dream, therefore none of it mattered. It was all a dream, therefore it mattered specifically to Dorothy. And it changed Dorothy as a character. Of course, my favorite thing to note is that at the end of The Wizard of Oz, Toto's still definitely dead. The old lady just broke her leg. There's no reason she wouldn't have Toto killed. Like, yeah, Toto gonna die. Yeah, fantasy. Tolkien emphasizes that through the use of fantasy, so this is what Tolkien says about fantasy. All he considers to be fantasy is imagination. And the author can bring the reader to experience a world as consistent and rational under rules other than those of the normal world. He calls this a rare achievement of art and notes that it was important to him as a reader. This says a lot about why The Lord of the Rings is the way it is. To Tolkien, it is very important that the fantasy world that is created is consistent. It's one of the reasons that I think the Chronicles of Narnia drove him so crazy. It's also interesting to note that in On Fairy Stories, he quotes G.K. Chesterton, which is really, really cool because it tells you that there was some cross-pollination between Chesterton and Tolkien.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, how do I want to put it? Like how especially British culture works, especially like their literary culture. Like there's so many fingerprints across all the boards for it. Like you can actually trace ideas that, like, you know, Lord Dunsany or George MacDonald talked about, to, you know, G.K. Chesterton and Tolkien, you know, to others until, you know, the current generation, where they sort of like took the opposite stances on everything. You know, it's like you trace it, like you can trace C.S. Lewis's stuff back to George MacDonald, to, you know, various Allegorian writers in the 17th century, you know, to, you know, things like Pilgrim's Progress, you know, which, even though the guy was surely aware of things like Canterbury Tales and Shakespeare and whatnot, is itself, you know, kind of a seminal standalone work of allegory. You know, it is a sort of myth arc. Not in the George Campbell sense, but in the sort of sense of, you know, oh, you might actually struggle in your Christian life, especially in our changing times. Well, it turns out, you know, things never really change, you know, and this is how things go. You know, like it's like you don't have to have literature about like why a Protestant would not want to be a Roman Catholic without, you know, for the layman, I want to be very clear, and not an educated person, but a person who only knows that they're not Catholic. Why is it, you know, that, you know, these things have to be this way? Well, you know, you describe it like a mountain that's bearing down on you. You know, the Roman Catholic has all these rules that you have to be Catholic, and you can never meet them. You know, you're never perfect enough. You know, things have changed since it has been written, but it helps, these allegories, these things descended from fairy tales that, you know, are in speaking with each other, from Lewis to, you know, Pilgrim's Progress, to more, you know, help the common man understand these things. You know, but not in a way of like the French literature, which I'm a big fan of Maupassant and Bellamy and other things like that. But really, it's just a sordid, even though it's a beautiful list, of sordid encounters, it's still just kind of a list of sordid encounters. Sometimes there's elements of heroism, that lift the soul, but it's just kind of beautiful. These French people, the Bellamy sleeping his way to the top, or, trying to anyway, has a certain flavor to it. And in an English sense, it would have been done very poorly, but the French do it very well because they're French. But it's, there's a loss of while we're talking about this, like, we don't want to lose the national character of these people talking about it. Wizard of Oz is the closest thing to like an American fairy tale, American legendarium. The only thing that we have besides that is what we call tall tales, which are usually turned into song or local legends, like Paul Bunyan, or literally a tall tale, or men like John Henry, who outdrove the outdrove the mining machine. Are we all John Henrys against the AI Demon Corps? I don't know. I believe so, in fact. But like there was an element of simplicity and beauty to them that you can't really replicate on purpose. You have to have John Henry's story and present it honestly. There was a movie in the 90s called Tall Tales, and it was about like a kid having various adventures with tall tales and becoming a man. And one of the things that went on that was like super good, just like the best, was that John Henry was plagued with visions of him dying in combat with the demon machine, with the spike driving machine. So it was like this destiny he had to be pulled back from to help the heroes. But eventually he gives into it, wins and dies. It's one of those things that like you can't fake. You can't hate your tall tales, your culture, and write something like that. You have to have an element of love to it. Even if they were trying to subvert it, I think the love won out on it. Wild Bill, lassoing a tornado and stuff like that. It's it creates a kind of thing beyond the nature of how do I, it creates something that can speak to multiple generations, but it's not really translatable to, say, Arabic or Chinese, maybe Japanese, because they have a martial and true literary culture, and not just everything is just Journey to the West in 1,000 different ways, or not everything is just, you know, whatever the fuck Bollywood is up to. Uh, you know,
Fucking Bollywood. I don't know, man.
yeah, like it's like, the stuff's fun, but it's actually quite light. Um, whereas China just kind of writes the same things over again. And I've read enough manhwa to know that Korea has got nothing going on upstairs. The only people who have any type of thought are the punks in their society.
Manhwa is garbage. It's so
Such
bad.
garbage. And it didn't
It's
used to
so
be like
bad.
that. It was
No.
it was almost a rival to manga, but like different mores and the online nature. Basically, they were addicted to their smartphones. It warped their ability to read comics, and so it destroyed their manhwa industry for anything interesting. There's like Hellrider or something, like I forget the name of it. There's like one good manga that's been written of the modern era of manhwa. Um, uh, what's his name? What's that one
I
guy who
don't know.
that black guy who does anime reviews? They got real famous real fast.
Oh,
Uh,
I know. Just some guy, I think.
no, uh,
I swear I know who you're talking about.
he just released a video too. It doesn't matter. But point
I
is,
don't. I'm not subscribed.
Helper, Hellper. There we go. I think that's it.
Might
Um,
be.
but not the name of it, the name of the manhwa. That's the only thing that's uninteresting, because it actually used the wide open space that manhwa uses. I'm sorry, this isn't a rant about fairy tales, but we'll get back to them. like so manhua has a style that's designed for cell phones. There's long blank spaces where nothing happens, and it's used as pauses in the same way that I use an ellipses to pause what a character's saying in Pinkerton's Ghosts. They use a blank space. um, so like the thing is that nothing really happens to it, and they don't actually use that space economically. Instead, they use it to like have a picture of the sky, and I don't know if it means anything. I don't know even if it means anything to them, or if they don't have it, they just complain that it doesn't have these gaps of moment or something like that. But it's like outside of various punk things that Korea has, some of which are just not good. Like as in like radical hatred for men, kind of not good. Like Andrea Dworkin wishes she had this amount of hatred in her heart. It's pretty insane some of the stuff you find. But it's like, you don't have any cultural things, touchstones. The reason why Japan, might have cultural touchstones with like England and America is because they have a true literary society where not every story is Bakemonogatari or Genji or something like that. I recently read Mishima's quadrilogy, Sea of Fertility quadrilogy. These stories are all completely different. They're almost philosophical works. They have a different mouthfeel to them. Like you could see him being well read. He might not reference Western literature or canon, but he's clearly, interacted with it enough that he can describe accurate Westerners or accurate people from another country. It's a mindset, a education that you don't see in Chinese individuals or Indian individuals for certain. Uh, like it's like like it's like the Arabians would take, especially when the Muslims took over a country, they would often take what was good and just get rid of the dross. They didn't care, especially when they started deciding they wanted to be, known for their intellectual pursuits for 100 odd years. Most of that was built on other people's things. But the thing is, they still had a culture that they referred back to it that they actually held quite sacred. So it's like the the loss of you know like they had a set of fables, the Thousand and One Nights, not fables, excuse me, fairy tales, in the Thousand and One Nights collection that they could kind of refer back to culturally. Where you had to be cruel and you had to be smart and you had to be shrewd, and certain things that these guys valued that may not necessarily be, what we Westerners value in any way, shape, or form, but it's culturally distinctively theirs, but also they could write stories that were not the Thousand and One Nights. Um, Especially when they interacted with other cultures. There are, sets of like Ottoman treatises, even though they were Turk, but you know what I mean, and other stories, pieces of wisdom. They could adapt things like Persian philosophy, wisdom culture into their own mindset with ease. But things like Hindus and Chinese Han just simply can't do that in the same way. Um, there's but it's, how do I want to put it? Like there's a conversation that's not happening in India and all the other sort of derivative cultures in China that is happening in Japan, for the Asians certainly, but is happening in England, does happen in America, but not necessarily in the same way in, say, France. But just for literature, things like animation and movies, France has its own conversation going that isn't readily apparent in, like, say, England. So, like, what I'm trying to say, my grand thesis of this long-winded rant is that cultural touchstones are more than just an individual story existing within their narrative ethos. The reason why Chinese and Hindu literature is so poor comparatively is because they are not in conversation. they decided that their ideas were right, and instead of working like Tolkien and Conan and others to develop what we do, even now, what men like Nathan Hood do, we're not developing. Well, sorry, we are developing things where other people simply aren't, and that's, I think, very important to keep in mind. There is an expectation, this Faustian idea that our civilization has going for it. There is a pushing on, a pursuit of higher natured story arcs, and while unfortunately, Tolkien topped us off for fantasy, and C.S. Lewis kind of topped us off for allegory, which I do consider fantasy allegory to be similar natured beasts, but like different, different breeds of the same species. Um, we can still push on in things like science fiction, and sort of like lower class fantasy, because there's things to talk about. What can we push on from Tolkien? I can't think of an idea. You know, um, maybe somebody with more um, learning can say, okay, actually, we can push it in this direction. They can do that. But in reality, my big idea is to tie the appearance of monsters to the holiness of the land, to the spiritual nature of the people within them, which isn't really a new idea at all. But in Pinkerton's Ghosts, as people become more godless, more monsters rise up. It does. It's a my conversation is with the spiritual and the philosophy and the fantasy, but not necessarily in the same way that Tolkien was discussing things all the way back to Beowulf, or C.S. Lewis was discussing things all the way back to Pilgrim's Progress, and of course to the Bible. There we go. Rant over.
Yeah, it's about being a part of a longer conversation. Japan has its own conversation that its stories are a part of. France does as well. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that France is one of the two countries in the world with a real comic book industry as well, along with Japan. America did. It kind of doesn't anymore because the American culture is like so dead now. But we did have a conversation going for a long time. And Britain did, and I don't know if it does anymore.
It kind of still does, but it's locked in a liberal paradigm, but differently from what America's locked into. Uh,
I
the
would argue worse.
Yeah, it's worse in some ways. Part of the reason why it's worse is because there's no way to. Um, so, like, in the '90s, English's punk became punk comics. I want to be very clear. Like 2000 AD and stuff like that became mainstream. They were kind of mainstream before, but now, like, everyone was reading them. Beano and Dandy were very popular, and it created a punk idea. But the problem is the punk became mainstream, and what they're fighting with, like, it's like the sort of like, oh, I'm so edgy, I'm gonna punch a fascist. It's like, brother, there's no such thing as a fascist government right now. Like, there's you are with the government on this. I cannot explain, like, the part of the reason why the Palestine thing jumped off so much is because the Palestine thing is countercultural, whereas these people who would normally be countercultural had no outlet before Palestine. As weird as that is to say, at best is what they could do is like say, "Oh, I'm a BLM guy," but in reality, all the governments of the world was supporting BLM. Either not really, but you know what I mean. All the powers that affected their daily lives were for BLM, so that's not actually punk. But but there are people who are naturally countercultural. So who attack the establishment, and so they couldn't do anything. But now they've got the Palestine thing, and that's what they're going for. It's like they're the same people spiritually who did a lot of things like 2001 2000 AD comic, Judge Dredd, and stuff like that. But the problem is that one, people are looking for Judge Dredd's looking pretty good right now, if you get me. And two, they're fighting against not punks, not their own government, but rather the American government that never really cared about them to begin with. Like I read a thing, 2080 or something like that, from like 4 or 5 years ago, and it was like people having an orgy and then flipping off an image of space Donald Trump, while people's balls, dick and balls, were floating in space in zero G. Like, what in the world are you trying to pull? Who are you writing for? Well, they're writing for themselves. The conversation's dead. But the skills and the fire is still there. It's just that nobody has anything to talk about. Like it's worse in the comics, which are agents of change in our own world. But in England, they're kind of just, yeah, we're punk. We follow establishment guidelines. We hate Trump. Yeah. And so they actually get more like interaction than with American comics. I hope that helps.
It does, yes. Yeah, I mean, I just know from what I've seen of like British culture, it's a wasteland.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I'm being a little unfair probably. I don't know a lot about it. So I know that Bollywood does have its own thing. Like I know Jaji, for example, El Jaji Lamplighter is a big fan of Bollywood, and they came out with at least one culturally significant movie, RRR, in the past like 5 years.
Yeah.
So make of that what you will. Yeah, but going back to fairy stories, though, since that was supposed to be the topic, I was discussing what Tolkien was trying to say about them. Yeah, he likes this thing. You need the contrast of enchantment and ordinariness. That's what Tolkien calls fantasy. Recovery. So when you see the magic of simple things in everyday life. Escape from the primary world, and consolation, a sort of happy ending. These can be applied to Tolkien's Middle-earth fantasies. You can probably apply it to someone like David Eddings and the Belgariad and that sort of thing. Zelazny, Rowling, maybe. I don't think that Tolkien would have liked Rowling very much because I'm like being entirely serious. Like, I don't think he would have been a big fan of Harry Potter because I don't think he would have liked the world building. He might have maybe been okay with the first couple books, as children's fantasies. But once Rowling started to like try and make the books grow up, I don't think he would have been very happy with them. Because Tolkien thinks that it's very important that the world is consistent when it comes to a fantasy story. And he thinks it's possible to do that. Now, there is a problem with Tolkien's definition of fairy stories, which is that his standards were so high that he's the only one that has ever been able to meet them. So nobody is as consistent as Tolkien. You could argue that you probably shouldn't even try. But this is what I mean by like Tolkien wasn't really writing in the tradition of earlier fantasies so much as he was looking at what he liked in fairy stories and what he considered to be a real or good fairy story. And then he was meeting that criteria himself by hearkening back to the older epics and stories, right? Beowulf and the Norse sagas specifically. That's why Tolkien's elves were different. That's why, like, The Lord of the Rings is in many ways an anti-fantasy. The Fellowship breaks up by the end of the first book. The wizard does one thing before he dies. Now, granted, he does do more later, but notably, he does not take part in the main quest. Right? The main quest is the two hobbits. And they are doing their own thing. In fact, the secret king who is returning to retake his throne after reforging the sword and whatever, he's also not part of the main quest. Got nothing to do with it. He is just doing his own thing. Like, it's really wild that The Lord of the Ring has become the template for fantasy when, like, you actually think about it for a moment. The entire plot of the final book everything that we see, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, which I consider to be the best scene in all of fantasy literature, contra Razorfist, who bizarrely claimed that Tolkien could not write battles and then didn't elaborate, which is so bizarre to me. I don't even know where to begin when he wrote literally the best battle scene in all of literature. And then you go, oh, Tolkien can't write battles. It's like, I'm sorry, what? On the other hand, Razorfist also called Chesterton a socialist. So, he says stuff sometimes. Anyway, you go into the Battle of Pelennor Fields and think about the plot of The Return of the King. The plot of The Return of the King is that all of the main heroes realize that they cannot possibly defeat the villain in direct battle. He's way too strong. And if they were to claim the power of the ring, then maybe they would win, but ultimately it would be worse for the world in the long run. And Sauron would probably then win in the long run eventually by dint of them using the ring. So it would certainly not be worth it. Therefore, their only chance, the absolute only possible thing that they could do, is act as if they're going to fight Sauron, draw out his army, and hope that it distracts him long enough that the two hobbits, who they have gotten no word from, absolutely no idea if they are alive, dead, or really doing anything, right? They don't even know where they're located. They haven't gotten any word from anyone outside of Faramir. Faramir is the last guy to see them weeks ago. So, and they're supposed to march into Mordor. So their plan is, let's have a battle and make it look like we're trying to win, even though we know we will lose, and hope it creates a big enough distraction that maybe Frodo can destroy the ring. And notably, just before this battle begins, they get pretty incontrovertible confirmation, all but 100% confirmation that Frodo is dead and the quest has completely failed and that everything they're doing is completely worthless. The messenger shows them Frodo's clothes. They're like, yeah, we found this in Mordor. They're doomed. They're doomed and they're all going to die. That's the end of the book. And then we cut to Sam and Frodo and actually see how it ends. But and then Frodo reaches the end of the quest, and as Tolkien has pointed out, Frodo fails. He does not accomplish his quest. He can't do it. Given the opportunity to destroy the ring and to destroy the ring and throw it into the fire, he just doesn't. And it takes Gollum to fulfill the oath that Frodo has bound him to earlier, that if he dared try to harm him, he would cast him into the fire. It aches this oath that he's bound Gollum to finally destroy the ring at the end. And then in what Tolkien calls a eucatastrophe, and and he would relate it to the resurrection at the end of the Gospels, right? Everything is suddenly almost magically reversed at the very last second. And you get this miraculous happy ending at the end of it all, where the orcs scatter and the eagles rescue Sam and Frodo at the very crack of Mount Doom. And Gandalf is alive. And yeah, they need to restore the Shire, and they do, but they do restore the Shire. So the Shire is restored, and then you get except it's not all back because the elves are going to leave, right? Basically what I'm saying is this is not a typical fantasy story. They don't just defeat the king and win, right? They don't defeat the evil villain and win. The evil villain's never defeated. He doesn't lose, not directly. They fight him in the Battle of Pelennor Fields and they manage to drive him off temporarily, but this is a temporary victory. They are certainly doomed.
I mean, I don't know. Even though, I guess it's a victory for the overall forces of good, because all Sauron is now is a ghost. Barely 10% of his power. Nothing more than a shade. But of course, he can come back in 1,000, 2,000 years. I'm sure. Maybe he's sitting in Whitehall right now in the guise of Tony Blair.
Oh
I
no,
don't
to be
know.
clear, I'm saying they absolutely succeeded in the quest. They
Oh,
defeated Sauron, like in that sense. I mean, they never like his army's not defeated. It's not like they marched into Mordor, challenged him, and then won. Right?
right. I get you.
Like that never happens. Even this is why, like, it's a long running joke with people who watch the movies and go, the orcs are the worst fighters in the world, right? Like, you don't get this impression so much in the books because the impression that you're getting in the books is that the orcs are throwing everything they have and the heroes are like barely hanging on, and they all know it's kind of doomed anyway.
Yeah.
Like, they can't really, there's no winning here. There's just holding out,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, it's look. Have you ever seen Tony Blair and Sauron in the same picture? You haven't. I'm
I
just
have
saying.
not.
I'm just saying.
It's a
Anyway,
good point.
but it creates like the reason we would keep coming back to Tolkien is because it stands at the top. It is sort of like the pinnacle of the line of logic and spirit that British fairy tales kind of follow through. There's a spirit to specifically British fairy tales that's a lot more. How do I want to put it? Like there's a certain cheerfulness even in your problems that the British fairy tales have that others simply don't. A good example of this is the Rumpelstiltskin story, which of course has different names in different countries and stuff like that, but is a fairly universal story among the European cultures. The different ones, and they even are changed to represent the spirit of the culture that they come from. The German story is the father is explicitly trying to sell on his daughter for money for reasons that, quite frankly, don't make a lot of sense. But it's Germany, and they're kind of just cruel to begin with. Then you have the Nordic one, which is sort of a series of, how do I want to put it? Like, no one's being malicious, but no one's being. It's not really a joke either. But then you have the British one, where the mother is mocking her daughter with a song that's saying, "Oh yeah, she's just spinning straw into gold. Oh my sweet daughters on the roof spinning straw into gold," and her daughter's like having a nap and refuses to help with the chores. And the prince hears this and goes, "Ah, that's pretty cool. She can do that." And the mother gets scared and goes, "Yeah, of course. Yeah." And of course, it goes through the story of Rumpelstiltskin. The little dwarf thing helps her out. She spends straw into gold, and the prince, finds out his name during a hunting trip. And it's in the English version. It's actually set kind of like, oh, I had a funny thing, happen to me, and it's actually treated with some cheer. But in the other stories, it's not really as cheery, even though I'm sure it's perfectly warm for their frigid ass cultures. Um, and it's like, oh, he was singing this song. Okay, can you remember it? You really need to remember this song. Oh, I think I'll remember it. Please, dear Prince, I want to hear this song more than anything else in the world. Please remember it. Like it's kind of funny. Like, oh, I don't know. Please, 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 please. And then of course, goes, "Hey, ninny, ninny, not my name. Your name is Tom Tit Tot." And Rumpelstiltskin character, whose name is Tom Tit Tot in England, in some cases, rips himself in half, or burns himself alive in rage, or just jumps out a window screaming. Um, there's a spiritual nature to the culture. If you were to read, French literature, one of the better Maupassant stories has these two friends go out, and they, which I know this isn't a fairy tale, but it's of the sort of spiritual nature of what these people valued. Maupassant would not be remembered except vaguely in a footnote if he didn't write good stories, where they're essentially going to be hung by Prussians who are sieging Paris or whatever city they're in. I think it's Paris, because they refuse to give up the secret way they are leaving from, and the passwords and so on, that they're leaving from the city so that they can fish. And instead of dying as sort of like deserters or traitors or whatever, they die as heroes because they keep this thing that would cause their city to burn secret. In many of the stories, there's an element of love between man and woman that isn't necessarily as apparent in other cultures. Where, for example, in some of the Bluebeard retellings or the Beauty and the Beast retellings, and quite frankly, I understand that Bluebeard and Beauty and the Beast have some same parents, but Beauty and the Beast is its own thing. It's just similar. Uh, it's a different breed of the same species, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, the thing
Uh,
about Beauty and the Beast that people don't understand, and is, I think, sometimes surprising to people, is that Beauty and the Beast is not like, oh, this is a folklore story that was recorded and then, like, no, it was written by a guy and published in a magazine.
yep,
Like, it was 100, it was entirely created. It's just a short story
yep.
from the 1800s.
But it's something like the 17th century, but it's earlier than that, earlier than what people say. Um, and the guy wrote it in a certain way. Oh, these young brides are having such a hard time with these cruel husbands. Bleeding heart liberal stuff for my fellow peasants in the mud. Disgusting, liberal behavior from those city folk. The king will sort them out soon, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. 1740, by the way.
Yep. So it's like but there's older stuff to it. Like there is a Serbian, I believe I'm getting the group right, a Serbian version and an Arabian Nights version that are much older than that. Both of them have similar ideas. In the Arabian Nights, they're all man-centric mostly. So it's a dude who is in a palace and there's 42 virgins or something like that, and then one day they go, oh, we have to go visit our father for 3 months. Here is here are the keys to the 90 rooms of the palace. Open all but this one, and then away we go. And they disappear. And he goes through the palace. Oh, I gotta open up this last door, and then there's a horse, and the horse takes him to a certain place and dashes out his eye. By the way, this is one of the stories about the one-eyed men that the Sheikh Harun al-Rashid, may he sleep in peace, is being told, along with his vizier, as he wandered about his city, the city of Baghdad, the city of peace, because these repetitive praises are in fact part of the experience. And then he has to get tied to a sheep, and the rock has to take him a certain place, and he might experience peace in Baghdad or something. It's like it's a similar pieces. In Serbia, they have the same sort of thing, where, except it's different, where the girl is captured by an ogre, which in and of itself is not a strange story. I would even say that many of the Blue Blood stories come from, and Beauty and the Beast stories come from that sort of vein, that descendants. And essentially, eventually, she does something to anger the ogre, and she gets word to her brothers, her 7 brothers, of course, who come and slay the beast through cunning and trickery and the speaking cat. So it's like there's bones of this fairy tale idea, but because of the sheer age of the story, it's become a fairy tale in and of itself. If someone were to say, is Beauty and the Beast a fairy tale? Any average person would say yes. You have to be educated to say, oh, actually, it's a relatively recent invention. But quite frankly, it was written around the same time that a bit earlier, in fact, that people like the Brothers Grimm were collecting these fairy stories to be preserved for generations to come, and different books of fairy stories and the Mabinogion and others. Uh, it's, like, just because you look at something and say, oh, this is the bones of this and that, you can't, stop it from being traced further back to different ideas and different stories that continuously evolve. It's like like I keep coming back to this idea. It's an idea with gravitational force that you simply can't like overcome Tolkien. So many of his competitors, in a way, people who wrote at the same time as him, actually wrote incredibly high level fantasy. The Ring Ouroboros is a good example with David Eddings. It is probably one of the best fantasy stories around. But it's held down by certain ideas that Tolkien, is memed about, but he never actually does. Tolkien never actually overdescribes anything. Like, sure, the walking sections into Two Towers is a little boring for me, but quite frankly, he doesn't actually repeat himself all that much. I just like want to get to the fighting bits. Um, it's why the Chronicles of Narnia are so thin compared to Lord of the Rings, even though they're playing on the same field, even though they're both very educated.
Oh yeah, the Tolkien spends forever describing a tree meme. It's so absolutely retarded and is clearly written by people who have never actually read Tolkien.
Yeah.
The irony of it is that Tolkien is actually quite concise. Like, I'm not even, this is entirely true. Tom Simon talks about this in Writing Down the Dragon. They said, like, it's the entirely opposite problem. Why does Tolkien use archaic words? Well, the reason is that they allow him to say more with less words.
Yep.
He can pack more information into less words. He's actually not long-winded at all. Like, read his description. I mentioned that I consider the Battle of Pelennor Fields to be the greatest battle scene perhaps ever written. Granted, I haven't read enough to really say, but it's hard for me to imagine one being better, right? Actually read the Rohirrim slaughtering the orcs. It's like, what, a couple paragraphs? It's not very long at all. If you actually read like them traveling in the Two Towers, it's not very long. Like, I have no idea. It's so bizarre where this came from. It really is. And it just comes from like, oh, he spends forever describing trees. Like, I don't know how to describe this except no, he fucking doesn't. Like, I don't even know where you made this mistake. It's just not a thing that Tolkien ever does. It's really, really weird. You mentioned German fairy tales, by the way. I know, I'm sorry for interrupting you for too long, but I did want to mention this. My favorites are Shock-Headed Peter. In that book. That? Oh, you don't know it. I suggest looking it up because it's hilarious. It's hilarious because it was written in the 1800s by some guy. I don't even know who it is. I think it was the 1800s it was written. Yeah, 1840. Let me see. Original publication. 1845, yeah. If you read the fairy tales, they're all incredibly violent, and many of them end with the children dying. So you get like Struwwelpeter describes a lazy, dirty boy. I'm just reading the Wikipedia summary, who does not groom himself properly and is consequently unpopular. Oh, that's normal, right? Like,
right.
The story of Wicked Frederick. A violent boy terrorizes animals and people. Eventually, he is bitten by a dog who goes on to eat the boy's food while Frederick is bedridden. Well, it's a little like, he's terrorizing people. It's a little darker, but, he gets his food eaten. That's not that bad. All right. The very sad tale with the matches. A girl plays with matches, accidentally ignites herself, and burns to death. Only her cats mourn her. That's the third story. Well, okay then.
So it's the average Kotaku journalist or whatever.
Yeah, and then of course, my personal favorite.
Is
Yes, the story of the thumbsucker. A mother warns her son Conrad not to suck his thumbs. However, when she goes out of the house, he resumes his thumb sucking until a roving tailor appears and cuts off his thumbs with giant scissors. And of course, the story of Soup Cat. I'm just reading all the most disturbing ones, which is most of them, to be fair, but not all of them. The story of Soup Casper begins as Casper, a healthy, strong boy, proclaims that he will no longer eat his soup. Over the next 5 days, he becomes skinny, wastes away, and dies. The last illustration is shown of his grave, which has a soup tureen atop it. So, little children, if you don't eat your soup, you will die.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and of
they
course,
have such a wonderful culture.
They do. The story of Flying Robert. A boy goes outside during a storm. The wind catches his umbrella and lifts him high into the air, with the boy sailing into the distance. The end.
Is there a moral?
Don't go out in the storm.
Of course.
Don't be ridiculous. Come on. It's dangerous.
Thank you, Germany.
Yeah, I love this because they're so casually violent and horrifying. It's just like, if you don't eat your soup, you will waste away and die. If you play with matches, only the cats will mourn you. And you will burn to death. Burn. Meanwhile, yeah. That's why the Brothers Grimm are German. All of the Grimm's fairy tales are so disturbing.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I just looked up the story of Flying Robert, and it does end with him never being seen again. So
wonderful.
There you go.
These people.
In case you were wondering how that one happened. What's funny, too, is that it starts off and you're like, okay, I guess these are like kind of disturbing, but for fairy tales. And then you go like, then the little match girl, she burns to death and only the cats mourn her.
But
I like that.
Cold? Yeah, she was cold and freezing to death, but she still shouldn't have played with those matches.
I like to think that that's the same fairy tale that as Hans Christian Andersen told from an outsider's perspective.
Probably.
They just want like the little match girl. You do it from Hans Christian Andersen, and it's like, oh, that's so sad. That's so tragic. I'm from Germany. Little fool should not have been playing with the matches. Only the cats cry now.
Her family was right to put her out without any crust of bread or clothes to keep her warm in the winter.
By the way, that's another. Before we end, I do want to discuss Hans Christian Andersen because I've mentioned this before. The Little Mermaid is one of my favorite short stories ever.
Right.
The real Little Mermaid, and it's so good that it kind of ruined the perfectly okay Disney version for me. Now, I will grant that the Disney version does have very good music. I really like Kiss the Girl. I'm so based. I listened to the version before they changed the lyrics to make it shitty. Just ultra based. Anyway, like the Disney version does have very good music. Under the Sea is a fun song. Poor Unfortunate Souls is fun. But it removes the heart of the original, which is one of the most beautiful Christian messages in any work of literature. And the climax of The Little Mermaid is so simply it's so simply written and so touching and so beautiful. It's like, and Disney got rid of it completely. It's just not there. Like nothing even close to it. So in the original Little Mermaid, the Little Mermaid now, she's failed. The prince has married someone else, right? Which is horrible. Right? She's going to die. She doesn't have a name. And then her sisters come and said, we have given our hair to the witch to obtain help for you that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again and form into a fish's tail, and you will be once more a mermaid, and return to us to live out your 300 years before you die and change into the salt sea foam. Haste then, he or you must die before sunrise. And then cutting ahead a bit, they sighed deeply and mournfully and sank down beneath the waves. And this is the paragraph. It is truly like one of the all-time great paragraphs in all of world literature. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent and beheld the fair bride with her head resting on the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his fair brow, then looked at the sky on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. Then she glanced at the sharp knife and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who whispered the name of his bride in his dreams. She was in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in the hand of the little mermaid. Then she flung it far away from her into the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun, and all around her floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, as they were also unseen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal, as the voice of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. So, yeah, the little mermaid realizes that she needs to kill the prince or she will die. Or actually worse than die. She will turn into sea foam and like her soul will be lost forever. And she's given the opportunity to return to her sisters and undo her mistake of becoming human and of trying to win a soul. And she can't do it. She chooses real love. Love for somebody who does not love her back. Mind. And she jumps into the sea and is rewarded for her act of selflessness by becoming one of the daughters of the air, where she can gain her immortal soul after 300 years of good deeds. None of this is in the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, and it ruins the movie for me because I know it should be.
It's a little less than what Hans Christian Andersen wrote. I should finish up the Imperial Press collection of fairy tales from their. Basically, they did a study that studied where fairy tales come from, and like basically traced out the Aryan Yamaya, whatever they're calling them nowadays, insertion into Europe, so that you can actually trace like the culture by the evolution of the story within it. It's very interesting. It's not less
That
about the
is interesting.
commentary, more about okay, these stories are clustered together, um, and these cultures had them, and here's basically how old, in order of age, kind of thing. It's very interesting stuff, but I do believe that Hans Christian Andersen and even horror shows like whatever the Germans were up to. Uh, there must be there must you know what I believe it. They deserve all their philosophers. I'm gonna say it. They deserve all the philosophers they got, and they got a lot of philosophers in Germany.
What, you mean you're not a fan of that great fairy tale? I need to find the name. Little Suckathumb? It introduced the character of the Great Tall Scissor Man.
It's okay. It's just okay. It's difficult. Whatever. It's fine.
For the record, Mark Twain wrote a translation of Shock-Headed Peter, which is awesome.
I believe it. He was a weird man.
I want to read it now. I'm gonna find it.
He's Mark Twain's kind of like a Harlan Ellison kind of character. He just wrote everything. I was kind of a jerk about it most of the time. Very interesting guy.
Yeah.
And I'd say, I don't know if Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court is like full on fairy tale level for for us yet. Like the Tall Tales are,
No,
but
definitely
like
not.
is Wizard of Oz though?
I would say so.
Okay. All right. Well, guys, I'm cutting it short. I'm tired. Sundays are always hard for me. I do a lot of work on Saturdays, and I slept through church today. That's my confession. I actually I woke up, dealt with my alarm, fell back, and I woke up again 3 hours later with my phone in my hand, with my thumb where the thing is off. Like I was just unconscious.
I should make fun of you, except that I have mass near me at 12 o'clock, so it's. I live in an area with so many masses that if I wanted to, I could go to mass as late as 5:30 in the evening.
Wow. Catholics.
You're not really supposed to, but it's there.
Right. No, it's well, like like it used to be at some of my older churches. They would have like a super early one for like the older people for some reason, and then they'd have a late one at like 11, a late sermon, and it's like I don't know. The church had like 50 people in it by the time I left because the pastor was terrible. But that's its own thing. That's its own story. Yeah, I think we've covered just about everything I wanted to cover. Thank you guys for listening in. I'll try to find a guest for next week, maybe, but we'll certainly have a lot more stuff to offer. I'm still working on the Kickstarter stuff. I'm now working on the guest episodes, which take a little bit longer. But yeah, I'll finish them up tomorrow probably, and get them all.
I also need to do something with Hightower Magazine. We need to publish our anthology of the first year stories. I have been focused on my own work recently, but I'm going to be done with that soon. I'm in the middle of so my collection After Camelot. It's been submitted to the publisher, and however, I really would like to add one more story, and I am in the middle of writing it, The Last Curse of Mordred. So I am in the middle of writing that story. Once it's done, then I am going to turn my focus to Hightower Magazine and publishing the first year anthology. So lots of things going on. And more than that besides. Forget about our personal lives. Holy crap. So much.
Why? What's new about your personal life? What could be happening in your personal life, Anthony?
Three weddings in this summer.
Wow, Anthony. You have to go to 3 weddings? That's crazy. That's crazy. When are you going to find a fiance, Anthony? When are you going to end this lonely existence?
Ben, please. Anthony. Every week, Ben.
All right.
She listens to the show.
That's too bad for her, isn't it? All right. All right, guys. Talk to you next week. We will have some more interesting stuff. In the middle of it, I plan on having some more streams, and I might actually make good on my promise to do a couple right streams. Have a good one.